entitled Becoming His Beloved, Answering God's Call to Discipleship, which I maintain for you to consider is what the Bible really is all aimed at. The Bible is aimed at you and me directly, and all of its events can be interpreted to find what it means to answer Jesus' Great Commission, which was to build the church by being and creating disciples. We have now arrived in our progress through Scripture to the place where the Exodus is actually occurring as predicted by God 400 years after the Israelites have been in Egypt. We have had the night of death that happened last night. So up until this time, we have been working with the Israelites and Moses in more recent times, struggling with becoming a people under a God whom they could not understand very much. And why? Because God's revelation to them through His commandments, His word, His prophets, His disciples, such as Abraham was a disciple. Now we have Moses, a prophet. But we have a people who have struggled to be a people of faith because the faith that they are ultimately to have and that we are to have has not taken shape and has not become clear. For 500 years, there has been relatively little revelation of God to His people. They were just growing into a people, which we now know is what the whole purpose of the 400 years was. So, they come to the morning that they are actually to leave after 400 years. They wake up, and all around them is the confusion of moving. Remember, the 70-member family of Jacob has now become, as scholars have generally agreed, between 1 and 2 million people. Think about that for a moment. We don't have a Cecil B. DeMille picture here of enough people that will fit in one camera shot. We have a procession of people and their livestock. Millions of animals are being moved in this great undertaking. It is mentally and physically astounding to these Israelites that not only are they leaving their home, but the home of their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents, and everybody they've ever heard of in their genealogy. They're leaving. And they don't actually know what's going to happen to them. Of course they don't know. And in addition to that, they wake up to their neighbors who are Egyptians with wailing and screaming as people discover their dead children in the house from the Passover the night before. Or they look out to where the Egyptian livestock are, and there is just untold numbers of dead animals laying on the ground. All of this has to be dealt with. So within that scenario, They are moving out, and they are not being followed by the Egyptians as you would have expected. The Egyptian army would have decided, well, if all of this has occurred, we're going to take retribution. But it's not going to be that day that they are followed. So Moses then goes, and Mallory, if we could go to the map. Moses follows something that in one way is a little difficult to understand. We know he was directed by God to do this. He's supposed to be leading the Israelites to the promised land. The promised land is Canaan, over by the Dead Sea on the map. But he's not taking them that way. One of the reasons that has been figured out by scholars is that because that path was heavily fortified by the Egyptian army, because it led to the border where the Philistines, who were a very powerful army, were on the way to Canaan. This would have put them in direct possible conflict with an angry army who would be blaming them for the death of their loved ones. And God even mentioned to Moses, the reason we're not going that way is because I don't want the people to become involved with a military conflict, because it would be just like them to decide, to heck with this, and everybody just turn right around and go home. That's right there in Scripture. So having that prediction, Moses is leading this enormous entourage of people and animals and carts and everything you can imagine, and he goes south. And now he has come to right what the scholars all pretty well agree is the place of the Red Sea crossing. It's at the top of the Gulf of Suez. The Gulf of Suez is part of the Red Sea. And right up at the top of the Gulf of Suez finger that is coming up, there is a huge area that is much like our coastal marshes here in the United States, where there's reeds that basically are standing in water, and sometimes when the tide is this way or that, they're even covered almost, or covered completely in water, but then it goes back down. Right below that, the Gulf of Suez, the Red Sea, begins, and there it is relatively shallow. And now, if you can imagine, we've come to the second night of the Exodus, and the Israelites are camped on the Egypt side of that upper reach of the Gulf of Suez, and behind them is the entire army of Pharaoh with 600 war chariots and untold thousands of soldiers, all intent upon their destruction and death. Imagine, if you will, that you are these frightened people with all of your family uprooted, chaos and confusion all around you, and here is a cloud of dust and the appearance of a vast army perfectly capable of killing you and everybody you love. This is the great showdown of God with Pharaoh and with the world, as they will learn, as you have learned and are learning. So how did the Israelites respond to this situation I've just described? With doubt. And we know throughout the Bible that even the faithful, often when presented with insurmountable problems and disappointments, the first response we are tempted to have is doubt. Well, God is dealing with that proclivity, that trend, beginning now. And we have in the 14th chapter of Exodus what we are talking about concerning the Israelites. The Israelites, seeing all of this threat, they come to Moses and say, "Didn't we tell you this would happen while we were still in Egypt? We said, 'Leave us alone. Let us be slaves to the Egyptians. It's better to be a slave in Egypt than to be dead in the wilderness.' But Moses told the people, 'Don't be afraid. Just stand still and watch the Lord rescue you today. The Egyptians you see today will never be seen again.'" Now I want to hearken you back to how this sort of revelation by God began with the plagues that we discussed last segment. Before each plague, Moses went to Pharaoh and told him to let my people go, saith the Lord, and he would tell him exactly what was about to happen and what happened each of those times. It happened exactly the way Moses and God said it would happen. Now Moses is speaking to his people who have seen all of this in exactly the same way that he had spoken to Pharaoh. "Yes, I understand how you feel," he's saying to them, "but I want you to, in place of doubt, I want you to put trust and watch what happens." Remember also that God is beginning in his revelations concerning himself, he is becoming much more vivid in terms of his actions and everything about his communication with Moses and his people. It's kind of interesting to watch that the way God got Moses' attention was a little bush that seemed to be on fire, but it didn't burn up. And here comes this voice, booming voice out of the blaze, and it's the voice of God. This little flame of this burning bush has now become, by night, a multi-story pillar of fire, which is leading the Israelite people exactly on their journey. During the day, when it would be difficult to see fire, it is replaced by a huge column of smoke. God has become much more visible in terms of knowing, the people knowing this has to be God that is with us. And notice how the pillar of fire is used strategically Because just as Moses is telling his people to trust instead of doubt, the pillar of fire, the column of smoke, is moving from beside the sea where it had led them there to around behind the Israelites and between them and the Egyptians. And the Egyptians have taken note of this also. And notice the Egyptians had them right where he wanted them. The Pharaoh had the people trapped beside a sea, and all they had to do was swoop in with the army and destroy them all, and the whole thing would have been over and done with, and we wouldn't be discussing this today. But he didn't, because he didn't know what to make of this pillar of fire and this big thing of smoke, and his soldiers didn't either, and so they waited for a whole day. And during that day and that night, God parted the relatively shallow waters that led from one side to the other, and then the wind blew and dried it. The column of fire moved around the next morning to its previous location by the sea and went straight through the path that had been opened. Now the Israelites looked much more vulnerable to Pharaoh and his big army, and that pesky column of smoke and fire we don't know what to make much of is way over yonder now, so now's the time to strike. So the Israelites go through the Red Sea crossing, and Pharaoh takes heart and decides, now what we'll do is we'll chase them and we'll catch them while they're crossing the sea or just getting on the other side. Remember what Moses told them? Take a good look at the Egyptians, because you're not going to see them anymore. And now that gives us the context of what happened. The great showdown is about to occur. The Israelites cross safely. Every one of them. Every cow, sheep, goat, chicken. Every person is on the other side. And here comes all of the Egyptians. The whole army is spread out in this trough of dry land with the water on each side. And what does God do? Just as Moses said he would. All of a sudden, there were no walls of water. The sea returned to normal, except the Egyptian army was under it. So what has happened? God is revealing his power to his chosen people. Guess what else he's revealing his power to? He's revealing his power to you and to me. Because we've just relived exactly what happened. And we can make the same thing of what has occurred that the Israelites made of it. But he is also revealing himself to Pharaoh and the rest of the world. We are going to see that the way God has led the Israelites out of Egypt, word spread immediately to the kingdoms that are up toward the promised land. And as we get to the events that occur concerning taking the promised land, we will know that the knowledge of what has just occurred at the Red Sea gives pause and gives concern to all of the kings whom they are going to confront, one by one. God is revealing that power. He is also revealing his sovereignty. I am the Lord, the only and one true God, is his message. So, how should we respond? How should we respond, or what can we see to what the Israelites thought? Remember? Why didn't you leave us where we were? Why did you bring us over here to die abandoned in the wilderness? Now God has revealed a lot of things concerning his character, his nature, and his power. And now at the end of the 14th chapter of Exodus, we have, when the people of Israel saw the mighty power that the Lord had unleashed against the Egyptians, they were filled with awe before him. They put their faith in the Lord and in his servant Moses. And we have learned, or are learning, just what they have learned and are learning, that as disciples and as the Israelites, our job is to remember how God treated them, and that treatment is available to each of us in just that way. So the message is, for those who trust in God, we have the sure knowledge beginning now that God always keeps his promises. Thank you.